Welcome back, everyone, to your channel. Tonight, we are going somewhere that feels both familiar and completely forgotten at the same time. We are going to 1950s America. Not the version you have seen in the advertisements. Not the gleaming kitchen with the smiling wife in the pressed apron, holding a casserole dish like she just won a trophy. Not the one with the perfect hair and the husband who comes home at 5:30 and says something charming while the roast sits on the table like a centerpiece at a banquet. We are going to the other side of the 1950s. The version that most people have never really thought about. The version where the kitchen floor is cracked linoleum, where the husband doesn't always come home at 5:30, where the roast, if there is one, is the result of genuine budget mathematics and 2 days of careful planning. We are going to spend today with the women nobody put in the advertisements. The ones who got up before anyone else in the house, and who went to bed last, and who kept everything running on nothing much at all. These were the poor and working class women of mid-century America. Women who lived in industrial neighborhoods in Chicago and Pittsburgh. Women who raised children in the hollows of Appalachia. Women who picked cotton in the Mississippi Delta. Women who shared a bathroom with 3 other families on the 4th floor of a building where the boiler only worked sometimes. Women who stretched $1 so thin you could read a newspaper through it, and who did it every single week without being celebrated by anyone, including history. And here's the hidden reality underneath the popular myth. The 1950s are often sold to us as the golden age of American homemaking, a decade of prosperity and domestic bliss, of women contentedly building warm and orderly homes while their husbands brought home comfortable paychecks. There is some truth in that picture, but it belongs to a specific sliver of American life, a white, suburban middle-class sliver. For the millions of women living below that comfortable waterline, the 1950s were something altogether different. They were a decade of extraordinary physical labor, financial precarity, limited legal rights, limited medical options, and a cultural expectation that you would smile through all of it without complaint. These women were not victims, though. They were resourceful, funny, tough, deeply communal, and remarkable in ways that deserve their own kind of attention. Their story is worth knowing. It is worth lying back and listening to. If you are new here, welcome. This is a channel where history meets the late evening hours, and where we try to make the past feel as close as a person sitting across the table from you. If you enjoy what we do here, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We release new episodes regularly, and every subscriber genuinely helps us keep making these. And if you want to leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from right now, we love seeing those. Whether you are in Ohio or Oklahoma, in Liverpool or Lagos, in a cold apartment or a warm bed, hello. We are glad you are here. Now, go ahead and dim the lights a little, if you haven't already. Set down whatever you are holding. Find a comfortable position. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. There is nothing urgent waiting for you tonight. The world outside can take care of itself for the next little while. Tonight, we are stepping back about 70 years, and we are going to follow one ordinary woman through one ordinary day. Let her name be something plain and solid. Let her name be Ruth. Ruth is 32 years old. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a building in a working-class neighborhood in a mid-sized industrial city. She has 3 children. Her husband Earl works at the factory down by the river. They make something that gets folded into cars, or washed down drains, or turned into something bigger than itself. Earl is not a bad man. He is tired and proud, and sometimes quiet for days at a time. The family has enough to eat, mostly. They do not have quite enough of anything else. This is Ruth's day, and it starts much earlier than you might think. The first thing you notice, if you are Ruth on an autumn morning in 1953, is the cold. Not the dramatic cold of a blizzard, but the everyday seeping cold in an apartment, where the radiator does not kick on until the building superintendent feels like it, and the building superintendent does not feel like it until 7 o'clock at the earliest. By the time September has given way to October, there is a layer of cold sitting about 3 inches above every floor in the building. Your feet know it before your brain does. You swing your legs off the side of the bed, and your bare feet touch the linoleum, and the linoleum pulls the warmth right out of the soles of them. It is 5:45 in the morning. You know this not because you look at the alarm clock, but because you have not needed an alarm clock in years. Your body has its own clock now, and it is not a friendly one. It is the kind of clock that doesn't have a snooze button. Earl is still asleep beside you. He doesn't need to be at the factory until 7, which means he won't be getting up for another hour at least. The children won't stir for another 45 minutes. The apartment is so quiet, you can hear the radiator in the hallway making that thin little metallic clicking sound it makes when it is warming up, which means the heat will arrive sometime around 6:15, which is too late to matter for the next hour and 15 minutes. You do not lie back down. You get up. This is perhaps the defining fact of Ruth's life. She gets up every single day. She gets up when she would rather not. And she starts moving through a long series of tasks that begins before the sun does and does not end until well after it sets. It is not dramatic. It is not glamorous. There is nobody watching. There is no music swelling behind her. It is simply a woman in a cold apartment in her nightgown padding toward the kitchen to start the coffee, and it is one of the most ordinary, extraordinary things in the world. The kitchen is small. If you stand in the middle of it and stretch your arms out sideways, your fingertips will almost touch opposite walls. The refrigerator is against one wall, and it hums with a slightly anxious quality, like it is working very hard to keep itself together. The stove is gas, which is important because gas stoves provide a little ambient warmth when they are lit, and right now that warmth is not a luxury. It is a mild medical necessity. You turn on 2 of the burners and hold your hands above them for a moment. The cold in your knuckles starts to soften. The coffee is a concern, not because you don't have any, but because coffee in 1953 for a working-class family is a budgeted item. It is not a given. You use a percolator, a dented aluminum one that your mother gave you when you got married. You measure out the grounds carefully, not overflowing the spoon, not quite level either. Somewhere in the middle, a scientist of small economies. The percolator goes on the back burner. You fill a pot with water from the tap, the hot water tap, because the building does have hot water, which makes you better off than approximately 1/3 of households in your neighborhood, though you have never really thought of it that way. The water that comes from the hot tap is not actually hot. It is tepid, aspiring toward warmth. You put it on anyway, while the percolator begins its slow, bubbling negotiation with gravity. You stand at the kitchen window. It is still dark outside. The alley below shows a row of metal garbage cans, a broken crate somebody left out, and a cat sitting on top of one of the cans with the specific dignity that cats maintain when they believe no one is watching. The street light at the corner is still on. It is casting that orangish glow it always casts, the color of a bruised peach, and it lights up the side of the building across the alley, so you can see the fire escape in the window boxes that Mrs. Kaminsky across the way fills with geraniums every summer. Though the geraniums are gone now, you watch the cat. The cat watches something you cannot see. This is not wasted time. This quiet 5 minutes at the window is possibly the only 5 minutes in Ruth's entire day that belongs entirely to her. She is not being asked for anything. She is not tending to anything. She is just standing in her kitchen in the early morning dark, watching a cat in an alley, and she is, in this particular moment, entirely her own person. This is worth noticing, because the rest of the day is going to ask a great deal of her. The percolator begins to perk. That sound, that rhythmic liquid thudding, is one of the reliable sounds of the 1950s working-class morning. It is a sound that means the day has officially started. You pour a cup when it is ready and you hold it in both hands, and you drink it black because you are watching the sugar this week, and you are always watching the sugar this week. It tastes like coffee, and also like the whole complicated fact of being awake. Now, if you are standing in this kitchen in 1953, and you take a moment to really look around, what you see is a very specific kind of American home that the history books tend to skip over. The apartment itself is not dirty. This is important. Ruth keeps it clean with a focus that borders on the military, partly from genuine pride and partly because the building inspector sometimes comes around, and partly because cleanliness is one of the things you can control when you cannot control very much else. But it is worn, thoroughly, patiently, democratically worn. The linoleum on the kitchen floor was once a cheerful yellow and white pattern. You can tell this because there is still a patch near the refrigerator where the foot traffic hasn't reached, and that patch still has its original color. The rest of it has been walked into a soft, undifferentiated beige. The walls are painted that particular shade of off-white that appears in rental apartments across the entire history of American housing. The shade that the landlord chose because it was cheap and because it hides ordinary dirt for approximately 1 year before it starts to show everything. The paint near the window is bubbling slightly because moisture gets around the frame every winter. You have put in 2 requests to have the window resealed. The landlord's response has been consistent and efficient silence. The sink has a crack in the enamel near the drain. The cupboard door on the left doesn't close all the way because the hinge is bent, so you keep a folded piece of cardboard tucked against the frame to hold it shut. This is not a sign of poverty. This is a sign of someone who has solved a problem with what was available. There is a distinction, though the world is not always good at making it. The 2-bedroom apartment houses 5 people. You and Earl sleep in 1 bedroom. The 3 children, whose names are Jimmy, who is 9, Patricia, who is 6, and the baby Thomas, who is 2, sleep in the other bedroom. Jimmy and Patricia share the bed. Thomas is in the crib that has been moved from corner to corner of that room over the past 2 years, trying to find a position that keeps the draft off him. The apartment measures something like 600 square feet in total, though nobody has measured exactly. This was actually fairly standard for working-class urban housing in the 1950s. Not luxurious. Not technically insufficient. Simply exactly as much space as 5 people can live in if they are efficient about it. And nobody is precious about personal space. Which, to be clear, nobody is. The bathroom is shared. There are 2 other apartments on this floor. The Kowalskis to the left and the Martins on the right. And all 3 families share 1 bathroom in the hallway. This is not the bathroom inside Ruth's apartment. There is no bathroom inside Ruth's apartment. The bathroom that all 3 families use is at the end of the hall, and it has a tub and a toilet, and a small window that doesn't open all the way and a hook on the back of the door, where someone is always leaving something they didn't mean to leave. In 1953, shared bathrooms for working-class apartment dwellers are not particularly unusual in cities. They are inconvenient. They require coordination. They require a certain philosophical acceptance of other people's schedules and a practical acceptance of other people's hair in the drain. You develop an understanding with the Kowalski family about morning bathroom time. Mrs. Kowalski is up at 5:30 for her husband, who works the early shift at the printing company. You are up at 5:45. There is a system of listening for the bathroom door and a set of unspoken rules that would impress a diplomat. The Martin family on the other side is less reliable, but their oldest daughter has been known to sing in the bathroom at 7 in the morning, which serves as an effective alarm for the entire floor. While the children are still asleep, and Earl hasn't stirred yet, Ruth has approximately 40 minutes to herself, which is 40 minutes to get a significant amount of work done before the household starts needing things. She begins a business of breakfast. In 1953, for a working-class family in a city apartment, breakfast is not complicated, but it is important. It is the first serious logistical exercise of the day. The icebox, because that is still what many people call it even when they mean the refrigerator, holds a glass bottle of milk delivered this morning, or possibly yesterday morning, if this is a 2-delivery week. It holds a paper carton of eggs. It holds a block of butter that is getting toward the end of itself. There's a loaf of bread on the counter. Not in the icebox, because bread keeps better at room temperature, and because icebox space is a resource to be managed. There is a can of oatmeal in the cupboard. There is a paper bag of flour. There is a small metal tin of lard on the shelf near the stove, because lard is cheaper than butter and does the same job in most situations. The children will have oatmeal with a small amount of brown sugar, because oatmeal is filling and cheap and can be made with water if you are careful about the milk supply. Patricia will complain about the oatmeal because Patricia is 6 and complaining about breakfast is essentially her part-time occupation. Jimmy will eat his without comment because Jimmy is 9 and has learned to measure his energies carefully, which is perhaps the most economically rational thing you can learn in a house like this. Thomas will eat whatever you put in front of him because Thomas is 2 and has not yet developed opinions about food, only about the quality and timing of physical affection, about which he has very strong opinions indeed. Earl will have 2 fried eggs and toast. This is not preferential treatment. Not exactly. Earl is doing physical labor for 8 to 10 hours today, and he needs the calories. This is a nutritional logic of the 1950s working-class household, and it is not entirely wrong. Even if it produces a certain domestic mathematics where the husband eats more than the wife without anyone really acknowledging that this is what is happening. Ruth will have whatever is left after everyone else has eaten. Today, that will probably be a piece of toast and the last cup of coffee in the percolator. She does not think of this as sacrifice. She thinks of it as the order of things. This distinction is important and also complicated, and also something that Betty Friedan will spend several years untangling in a book that won't be published until 1963, at which point Ruth will have been doing this for over a decade already. The oatmeal goes on. The small pot fills with water, and a measured cup and a half of oats. You stir it once and adjust the flame, and turn around to start slicing the bread. The bread knife is dull. It has been dull for 3 months, and you have been meaning to have it sharpened, and you have not had a chance to have it sharpened, and at some point you stop noticing that it is dull, and you just press harder. The bread tears slightly at the end of each slice, but this does not matter, because the bread is going to be toasted anyway, which will unify it. The toast goes under the broiler of the gas oven. You watch it the way you watch anything that can go from fine to ruin in about 45 seconds. In a house where food is purchased carefully and nothing is wasted, if it can be helped, burnt toast is a minor tragedy. You pull it out perfectly golden. You spread the butter thin, because that is how you spread butter. Earl comes into the kitchen at 6:30. He is a big man, Earl, with large hands and a way of moving through a small space that suggests he would prefer a somewhat larger space, but has made peace with the one he has. He says good morning. You say good morning. He pours himself a cup of coffee from the percolator, which still has enough left. He sits at the kitchen table, which seats for if you arrange the chairs carefully, and he reads a newspaper, which costs 3 cents and which the family has delivered because it is a considered luxury, the kind of thing that costs a small amount and provides a genuine daily dividend in information and the feeling of being connected to the world. He reads the sports page first. You know this without looking. The children begin to wake. You hear them through the wall. The thump of small feet hitting the floor, the particular sound of 2 children negotiating the use of a shared blanket that they have long since stopped sharing amicably. Jimmy comes into the kitchen first. He is wearing a white undershirt and a pair of pants that are slightly too short. You put a bowl of oatmeal in front of him without being asked, and he eats it with the automatic efficiency of someone who knows there is a schedule to keep. He has school in an hour. Patricia comes in behind him and immediately announces that she is not hungry, which is her standard opening gambit. You put the oatmeal in front of her anyway. She eats it. Thomas you carry in from the bedroom. Still warm from sleep, his hair flattened on one side and sticking up on the other, his face crumpled with a sort of pleasant confusion about why morning keeps happening to him. You put him in the wooden high chair that is wedged between the refrigerator and the wall. He eats a few spoonfuls of oatmeal and then focuses primarily on distributing some of it across the tray of the high chair in what can only be described as a scientific investigation of its spreadability. The kitchen, which was quiet and almost peaceful 40 minutes ago, is now operating at full capacity. Now, before we follow Ruth into the rest of her morning, it is worth understanding the specific geography of the neighborhood she lives in, because geography is destiny in the 1950s even more than it usually is. The building she lives in is one of maybe a dozen nearly identical buildings on this block, all of them built sometime between 1910 and 1925, all of them 3 or 4 stories of brick with fire escapes bolted to the front, all of them occupied by the same general population. Factory workers, machinists, delivery men, women who work at the laundry or the diner or who take in work at home, a few widows living alone in single rooms, a family or 2 who have recently arrived from somewhere else and are in the process of figuring out how all of this works. The neighborhood is not what the newspapers would call a slum, though it is one good recession away from looking more like one. It is what people at the time call a working-class neighborhood, which is not a euphemism, so much as an accurate description of who lives there and what they do. The streets are mostly clean, because the city still services them, though not as attentively as it services the neighborhoods farther north where the people are somewhat richer. The sidewalks are cracked. The corner store is open 6 days a week and operates on a credit system that most of the neighborhood depends on between paydays. The Catholic Church 3 blocks east is the institutional center of a good portion of the community's social and spiritual life. The bar on the corner is the institutional center of a different portion. There are no lawns. There are no driveways. There are no washing machines in the apartment, because the apartments are not built with the plumbing for them, and there is not really room anyway. There's a laundromat 2 blocks away that opened in 1950, and that represents what was at the time a genuine revolution in how working-class women spent their Mondays, though calling it a revolution might be generous. Laundry is still laundry, which is something we will need to get to, because laundry in the 1950s is its own separate universe of effort. But first, there is the matter of getting the children out the door. Getting Jimmy and Patricia ready for school is a process that takes approximately twice as long as it should, which is true of getting children ready for school in every era of human history, and is perhaps the only domestic constant that has not changed in any meaningful way since the Roman Empire. The shoes need to be found. One of them is always missing. Not both, just one, which is somehow worse than both being missing, because 2 missing shoes suggest a systemic failure, whereas 1 missing shoe suggests a specific individual failure that happened at a specific moment and ought, theoretically, to be traceable. The shoe is eventually found. It is behind the radiator in the bedroom. How it got behind the radiator is a question that will never be satisfactorily answered. Jimmy's school clothes are the ones he wears every day, more or less. He has 2 sets of school clothes, which he rotates. Ruth washed and pressed 1 set on Saturday. She will wash the other on Wednesday. He has a winter coat that is 1 size too large for him, which is intentional. You buy children's coats 1 size too large because they are expensive and children grow. This is not a secret. This is simply the arithmetic of raising children on a budget, and every mother on this street knows it without ever having discussed it formally. Patricia has a dress that she loves and 2 that she is indifferent to. She wears the one she loves as often as possible. You have told her several times that she should alternate the dresses so the one she loves doesn't wear out. She is 6. She has heard this argument and found it unpersuasive. You pack their lunches in brown paper bags. Each bag contains a sandwich made of peanut butter or bologna, whichever is more available this week. A piece of fruit if there is fruit. An apple or a banana, something that will survive being carried in a school bag for 3 hours without turning into a science experiment. Sometimes a cookie if you baked on Sunday. The lunches are packed with the practiced speed of someone who has done this many hundreds of times. You fold the top of each bag down twice and hand them to the children at the door. Jimmy takes his without ceremony. Patricia takes hers, looks at it for a moment as though evaluating its authenticity, and then puts it in her bag. They go down the stairs. You lean over the second floor railing and watch them emerge from the front door of the building and turn left toward school. Jimmy walks fast. Patricia skips. You watch until they round the corner, and then you go back inside. Earl has left for work while you were doing the coats and the shoes. He said goodbye to the children, ruffled Jimmy's hair, kissed Patricia on the top of her head, and was out the door with his lunchbox, a gray metal box that goes with him to the factory every single weekday, like a faithful but unpretentious companion. He will be gone until 5 or 5:30, depending on whether they run overtime, which happens about 2 weeks out every 4, because the factory is working hard to meet some kind of contract. The apartment, which 15 minutes ago was full of noise and small people and the smell of oatmeal and burnt toast, is now quiet again except for Thomas, who is in the kitchen investigating the contents of a low cabinet that you have not yet childproof, because childproofing is not really a concept that exists yet as such. The pots he is pulling out are making a satisfying rhythmic clanging that seems to please him enormously. You stand in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. You are 32 years old. You have been awake since 5:45. It is now 7:25. You have made coffee, made breakfast for 5 people, packed 2 school lunches, found a shoe, dressed 2 children, and dispatched them to the world. You have also cleaned up the oatmeal pot and the egg pan and the plates and wiped down the stove and wiped down Thomas's high chair tray, which required some dedication, given what he did to it. Now the real day begins. What you are facing for the next several hours, while Thomas is awake and needs supervision, and you cannot leave the apartment, is the work of housekeeping. And here is where the 1950s working-class home diverges most dramatically from the image in the advertisements. Because the advertisements in 1953 are full of women housekeeping effortlessly with the help of miraculous modern appliances. There's the woman with the electric vacuum cleaner, gliding over clean carpets. There's the woman with the automatic washing machine, smiling at a porthole window while the machine does the work. There's a woman with a refrigerator with 3 separate compartments and a built-in ice maker, organizing her fresh vegetables in a way that suggests she has a great deal of enjoyable time to spend organizing her fresh vegetables. Ruth does not have an electric vacuum cleaner. She has a carpet sweeper, which is a mechanical device with rotating brushes that you push across the floor, and which picks up most things but requires a significant amount of effort and which you need to empty after every use. She does not have an automatic washing machine because the apartment doesn't have the plumbing for one, and because it costs approximately $130 in 1953, which represents several weeks of Earl's salary. And there are always things that the money is needed for first. What Ruth has is a mop. She has a broom. She has a scrub brush and a bucket. She has a bottle of ammonia and a bottle of white vinegar and a bar of Fell's Naphtha soap, which is a laundry soap, but which also works as a general-purpose cleaner in various concentrations depending on what you're cleaning. She has rags cut from old shirts. She has her hands, which are rougher than they were when she was 20 and will be rougher still when she is 40. And she has a system. Ruth's housekeeping operates on a daily and weekly rotation that would satisfy a military planner. Not because someone told her to set up this way, but because it is the only way to keep a 600-square-foot apartment housing 5 people from descending into genuine disorder, and because genuine disorder is something she cannot afford in any sense of that word. The system is this. Some things happen every day. Some things happen twice a week. Some things happen once a week. The daily things are the dishes, the cooking surfaces, the sweeping, and the basic management of Thomas. The twice-a-week things are the bathroom and the mopping. The once-a-week things are the windows, the laundry, the thorough scrubbing of the kitchen, and the changing of the bed linens. This does not sound complicated on paper. On paper, it sounds like a simple list. In practice, it is something like 8 hours of sustained physical work spread across the day, interspersed with a 2-year-old who has his own agenda, and performed largely in a space that doesn't give you much room to do anything at scale. You start with the bedroom. You pull back the sheets, shake them, and spread them back. You fluff the pillows. This is not laundry day, so the sheets stay on. You straighten the children's room, which involves returning several things to places they do not remain in for long, including one of Thomas's shoes, which has somehow ended up under the children's bed, despite the fact that Thomas cannot walk well enough to put there intentionally, which suggests an interesting and unknowable sequence of events that you don't have time to investigate. You sweep the bedroom floors with a broom, pushing the dust toward the door, and then into the hallway, and then toward the utility closet at the end of the hall, where you keep the dustpan. The dust in old city apartments has a specific quality. It is not the fluffy, clean dust of new buildings. It has texture. It has history. It contains particles of the building itself, shed slowly over decades, mingle with whatever comes into the window gaps, mingle with the fine debris of 5 human beings going about their physical existence. The broom handles it with a sort of patient resignation. Thomas follows you from room to room. He is at the stage of childhood development, where the most interesting thing in the world is whatever the nearest adult is doing. He watches you sweep with an expression of concentrated study. He picks up a dust bunny and examines it. You take the dust bunny away from him without breaking stride, and he looks mildly betrayed, and then notices a shadow on the wall that is more interesting anyway. The kitchen floor gets the mop. The mop is a string mop in a bucket of water, with a splash of vinegar, which cuts through the cooking grease that settles on every surface in a kitchen that runs on a gas stove. The mopping takes about 12 minutes. It requires you to work backwards from the far corner toward the door, which is a correct technique, and also something you didn't know when you first got married and learned the hard way when you mopped yourself into a corner and had to stand there waiting for it to dry with a 2-year-old version of Jimmy staring at you, as though this was the most entertaining thing he had ever witnessed. While the kitchen floor dries, you move to the bathroom down the hall, timing it for the window between when Mrs. Kowalski finishes her morning and when the Martin daughter starts her morning, which gives you approximately 20 minutes. You carry your bucket and your brush and your cleanser, which is a kind of old Dutch cleanser, a powder that is effective and also smells quite intensely of its effectiveness. The bathroom has a tub with feet for iron claw feet, the kind that every building like this seems to have because they were installed when the building was built and they have outlasted several generations of tenants and will outlast several more. The tub is clean, but the grout around the tiles is a gray quality that no amount of scrubbing has ever entirely removed. You scrub it anyway. You scrub the toilet. You wipe down the mirror, which has a crack in the lower right corner that has been there since before you moved in. You get everything gleaming, and then you gather your things and go back to your apartment and close the door behind you. By 9:30 in the morning, you have accomplished more sustained physical work than most people in the 21st century will accomplish in an entire day. And you have done it with a 2-year-old orbiting you the entire time. You're not tired yet, exactly. But there's a low-grade awareness in your body that has been asked to do a lot since 5:45, and that it will continue to be asked to do a lot for many more hours. Your lower back, which has been giving you quiet trouble since Thomas's birth, is registering its mild, ongoing objection to the mopping. You make yourself a second cup of coffee. It is weak. The grounds have been to the percolator once already, and you are stretching them because you are stretching everything. But it is hot, and it is coffee, and you drink it standing at the kitchen counter, while Thomas sits on the kitchen floor with 2 wooden spoons and a pot, and conducts what sounds like a percussion recital for an audience of 0. The performance is enthusiastic. You note this, but do not comment on it. Now, you need to think about what you're going to do with the rest of the morning, and this is where things get genuinely complicated, because Ruth's day is not just the maintenance of a household. There's a question of shopping, of mending, of whatever needs doing for the neighbors, of the occasional thing that goes wrong and needs to be handled. And underneath all of it, the perpetual question of the budget. Money in a household like Ruth's is a specific and constant kind of presence. It is not a comfortable background assumption. It is not something that happens automatically. It is something that requires management and thought and planning every single day. And the person doing that management and thought and planning is almost always the wife. Earl earns approximately $62 a week at the factory in 1953, which puts the family solidly in the working class, but not securely there. After rent, which is $45 a month in utilities and food, and the children's school supplies, and the minimum necessities of keeping 5 people clothed, and the occasional medical bill, and the small discretionary items that make life feel like a life rather than a logistics exercise, there is not much left. There is sometimes a little left, and sometimes not. There is a small account at the bank with enough in it to handle one medium-sized emergency. And the rule of the house, unspoken but absolute, is that you do not touch that account unless you have to. Ruth is the keeper of this economy. She knows what everything costs. She knows what is on sale this week at the A&P, which is the supermarket 3 blocks north, and what is on sale at the corner store, which is more expensive than the A&P for most things, but is closer and gives credit. She knows that bread is 15 cents at the A&P and 18 cents at the corner store, and that the difference is 3 cents, and that 3 cents times 3 loaves a week is 9 cents a week, which is $4.68 a year. And that $4.68 is what Thomas's winter boots cost last year. She knows this not because she sat down and calculated it. She knows it because this is the kind of mathematics that her life requires, and she has therefore become very good at it. The shopping trip is today's main excursion. You put Thomas's coat on him, which he resists with the philosophical conviction of a child who cannot yet explain his objections but has no shortage of them. You wrestle the coat onto him with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been in this negotiation for 2 years. You put on your own coat, which is a wool coat you bought secondhand at the church rummage sale 2 years ago in a brown, that is not your best color, but which is warm and which was $1.50. You put the shopping bag over your arm. The shopping bag is a canvas bag with handles, because paper bags tear if you're walking more than 2 blocks, and Ruth is going to walk 4 blocks today, and she is already carrying Thomas. Thomas in Ruth's arms is 28 pounds of affectionate ballast. He rides on her hip with the comfortable ownership of a very small person who has never had to worry about whether they will be carried. His head is against her shoulder. His small hands have hold of her coat collar. The morning has gotten warmer as the sun came up, and the air has that clear, dry quality of an October morning that makes the city look better than it is, the bricks brighter, the sky a harder blue. The streets between your building and the A and P are what your neighborhood looks like in the daytime. The bars are closed and their signs are dark. The church is open, or at least the door is open, because Father Callahan opens at 8 and it stays open until 6. Two women who Ruth knows are talking outside the greengrocer's, which is a separate shop from the supermarket, an Italian family's place where the vegetables are fresher than the A&Ps. She waves to them. They wave back. One of them calls something about a church meeting on Thursday. Ruth nods. She will probably go to the church meeting. Church meetings are one of the infrastructure elements of her social life. The A&P is a full-service supermarket, which sounds redundant now, but was actually a meaningful distinction in 1953. A full-service supermarket means that you can get most of your regular grocery needs under one roof, as opposed to going to a separate butcher and a separate baker and a separate greengrocer, which is how shopping worked for most people before the 1930s, and which is how many people still shop in Ruth's neighborhood out of habit or loyalty, or because the individual shops give better credit or better quality, or both. Ruth goes to the A&P for most things and to the Italian greengrocer for things where the greengrocer's quality is worth a slightly higher price, and to the corner store for things she runs out between shopping days. This is a tripart economy of household purchasing that she navigates without effort because she has been navigating it for years. Inside the A&P, she moves with intention. There is no browsing. There is no impulse purchasing. She has a list in her head, which is where she keeps the list because paper costs something and she doesn't need it. Ground beef, because Earl likes hamburgers on Friday, and because ground beef is 31 cents a pound and is a reasonable way to get protein into the family. A can of tomatoes, because she is making sauce this week. Dried beans, because beans stretch everything and provide protein and are 12 cents a pound and you could do a great many things with them. Oatmeal, obviously. A new bottle of milk, because the delivery comes 3 days a week and this is not a delivery day. A loaf of bread. Potatoes, because potatoes are the working class vegetable of the century, endlessly useful, filling, cheap, and able to absorb the flavor of whatever you cook them with. An onion. 2 onions. Carrots when they're not too expensive, and today they are acceptable. She does not buy anything that is not on the list. She does buy the day-old bread, which is displayed at the end of the aisle in a wooden bin, and which costs 8 cents instead of 15, because it is yesterday's bread, and the supermarket wants to move it rather than throw it out. Day-old bread makes perfectly acceptable toast and perfectly acceptable bread, pudding in perfectly fine sandwiches, if you're not rigid about your sandwiches being on fresh bread, which Ruth is not, because she is not rigid about things that would cost her 7 cents a loaf. The transaction at the checkout is a moment of modest arithmetic, performed by both the cashier and Ruth simultaneously. The cashier adds up the total, and Ruth keeps a running count in her head. They arrive at the same number, or close enough. She pays in cash, counting the bills and coins from her purse with particular attentiveness of someone for whom the amount matters. She takes the change carefully. She puts it in the exact pocket of her purse where the grocery money lives, separate from the general household funds, which live in a different pocket, separate from the envelope in the kitchen drawer at home where the rent money accumulates over the month, separate from everything else. These are the compartments of a budget managed entirely in a purse and a kitchen drawer and a person's memory. Ruth has never had a bank account in her own name. This is not an oversight. In 1953, a married woman in most states cannot open a bank account without her husband's signature. She cannot apply for a credit card in her own name. She cannot take out a loan. The financial infrastructure of the country does not recognize her as an independent economic actor in any meaningful way. She is legally and practically economically secondary to Earl. Earl is a decent man and he gives her the household money without making a power struggle, but the structure exists regardless of Earl's decency, and Ruth knows it, in the way you know things that are simply part of the landscape you live in. She hoists Thomas back onto her hip and picks up the bag, which is heavy now. 4 blocks home. The bag pulls at her arm. Thomas pulls at her collar. Her lower back offers its ongoing editorial opinion. She walks at the pace of a woman who is carrying 28 pounds on one hip and a week's worth of groceries on the other arm, and who has a list of things to accomplish before 2 o'clock. She does not hurry. Hurrying would be inefficient. She walks at the pace she can sustain. Back at the apartment, Groceries away. Thomas installed in the living room a set of wooden blocks that his grandmother made out of pieces of scrap lumber sanded smooth. Ruth has maybe an hour before she needs to start thinking about lunch. She sits down at the kitchen table with her mending basket. The mending basket is a wicker basket that holds what amounts to the textile history of the household. Jimmy's school pants have a torn knee that needs a patch. Earl's work shirt has a fraying cuff that she is going to reinforce before it becomes a hole. Patricia has managed to pop a button off her dress, which is the sort of thing Patricia does regularly and without explanation. Thomas has a pair of socks where the heel is wearing thin, and she is going to darn them before they give out entirely. Because a new pair of children's socks is 15 cents, and that 15 cents is always needed somewhere else. Mending is not a lost art in 1953. It is an active practice. Women in working-class households mend because clothing is expensive relative to income, and because the only alternative to mending is replacing, and replacing is not always possible. A woman who is good with a needle can extend the life of a garment by months or years. Ruth is good with a needle. Her mother was good with a needle. Her grandmother was good with a needle. This is not a romantic inheritance. It is a practical one. She threads a needle without looking. She patches Jimmy's knee with a piece of fabric cut from an old shirt of Earl's that has been retired to the rag-end patch drawer, which every household of this type maintains. The patch fabric is a slightly different shade of blue than the pants, but close enough that nobody will spend time scrutinizing it. She reinforces Earl's cuff with small, tight stitches that will hold through dozens of washings. She sews Patricia's button back on with the button stitch that ensures it will not come off again anytime soon, which is an optimistic goal, but a worthwhile one. The darning of Thomas's socks requires a darning egg, which is a wooden egg-shaped object you insert into the sock to give yourself a surface to work against. Ruth's darning egg belonged to her mother. It is smooth and worn and fits in her palm perfectly. She fills in the thin area of the heel with careful parallel stitches, covering it in a grid that will hold the weight of small feet for another few months. The whole process is oddly satisfying in a way that is difficult to articulate. It is the satisfaction of making a thing work again, of not wasting, of understanding the object well enough to repair it. Thomas comes in from the living room, carrying a block. He shows it to Ruth. She admires it. He carries it back to the living room. This exchange takes approximately 4 seconds, and is fully sufficient to satisfy whatever need he came to satisfy. By 11:30, the mending is done, or at least the pressing items are done. There's always more in the basket. There's always more in the basket. But the pressing things are handled, and that is what matters. Ruth puts the basket away and turns her attention to lunch. Lunch on a weekday is simple and quick. Thomas gets bread and butter and a cup of milk. Ruth gets whatever's around, which today is bread and butter and a cup of tea, because the tea is comforting, and she has not had anything truly warm since the second cup of coffee at 9:30, and it is now 11:45, and her body will like something warm. She makes the tea in a chipped mug, not a cup. She has cups, but the cups are for company. She eats standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the alley. The cat from this morning is gone. A different cat is there now, or possibly the same cat in a different state of mind. It is impossible to say. The alley looks somewhat cheerier in the daytime. Somebody has put a potted plant on their fire escape, a chrysanthemum in a clay pot, orange and vigorous, catching the October sun. It occurs to you, if you are Ruth, that the chrysanthemum is a small but genuine act of beauty in an environment that does not particularly demand beauty. Somebody looked at a metal fire escape in an alley and thought, this would be improved by a chrysanthemum, and they were right. This is the kind of thing Ruth notices. It is not a grand aesthetic observation. It is a small one. But small observations are what you accumulate when you spend most of your time inside a 600-square-foot apartment in an industrial neighborhood in a city that does not go out of its way to be pretty. After lunch, Thomas naps. This is the most valuable hour and a half in Ruth's day, the nap period, and she is deeply aware of its value in the way you are aware of the value of things that can be taken away without warning. She puts him down in the crib and closes the bedroom door, and for 90 minutes the apartment is quiet except for the sound of the building around her, the pipes and the radiator, and the sound of the Kowalski family 2 feet away through the plaster wall. She does not nap. She has things to do. Today is not laundry day, which is Monday, but there's a basket of things that can't wait, Earl's work shirt being one of them. which got a grease stain on it last Friday that she has been soaking in a solution of Fell's naphtha soap and water all weekend, and which she now needs to scrub and rinse and wring and hang. She does this in the kitchen sink, bent over the sink with the washboard that lives in the cabinet under the sink. The washboard is a wooden frame with a corrugated zinc surface, and you use it by pressing the fabric against the ribs and working it back and forth with your hands, using the friction to drive the soap and the effort into the fibers of the cloth. It is not gentle work. Your knuckles press against the zinc. The water is hot because hot water is what gets grease out. Your back bends over the sink in a curve it doesn't particularly enjoy. The soap is strong enough to do the job, and also strong enough to do a number on the skin of your hands, if you do this without gloves. And Ruth's hands show the evidence of years of this. They are red at the knuckle. The skin across the back of them is drier than it ought to be. There is a small crack in the skin near the base of her right thumb that has been there since February, and hasn't quite healed, because every time it gets close to healing, she has to put her hands in water again. A small bottle of hand lotion from the drugstore sits on the windowsill above the sink. Jergens, the amber bottle. She uses it every night before bed. It helps but doesn't entirely solve the problem. The problem is structural. The problem is that her hands are a tool of the work she does, and the work she does is hard on hands. The lotion is what it is, a small, imperfect kindness she does for herself at the end of the day. The shirt goes on the drying rack near the radiator. In summer, she would hang things out the window on the clothesline that runs between her building and the one across the alley. In October, the indoor drying rack gets more use. The apartment, when laundry is dry near the radiator, takes on a particular domestic atmosphere. Slightly steamy, slightly soapy, warm in a very specific way that is one of those indoor sensory experiences that becomes embedded in memory without your permission. By 2:30, Thomas has begun to stir. You can hear him in the crib, talking to something. He talks to things in the crib when he is waking up. A monologue directed at the ceiling or the window, or possibly an audience that only he can perceive. The monologue is not unhappy. It is exploratory. You let go for a few minutes and then go get him. The afternoon is a different kind of rhythm from the morning. The morning has tasks with clear completion states. The afternoon with a 2-year-old is more fluid and more demanding in a different way. You cannot focus on any single thing for very long. You're always partly managing Thomas, partly managing whatever task you have taken on, partly listening for the sounds that mean something is going wrong versus the sounds that mean everything is fine. A 2-year-old at play generates a range of sounds. There are the good sounds, the blocks clicking, the small voice conducting play narratives, the various noises of happy investigation. And then there are the silences that are not relaxed silences, but deliberate silences. The silences of a small person who has found something interesting to do that they correctly anticipate will be a concern to the adults. The deliberate silence is more alarming than the noise. You learn this early. This afternoon, the deliberate silence occurs at 3:15. You find Thomas in the bathroom, having figured out how to open the door, which he was not supposed to be able to do. He has a toilet brush in one hand and an expression of scientific inquiry. You remove the toilet brush from his possession. He expresses his opinion about this. You return him to the living room. You secure the bathroom door with the additional latch you should have installed 2 months ago, and now immediately go install with a screwdriver and the hardware that has been sitting in the kitchen drawer waiting for this moment to become urgent enough to address. You are competent with a screwdriver. You are competent with most basic tools, because in a household where the landlord is not going to fix things on any schedule that suits the tenant, and where hiring someone to fix things is a cost that has to be weighed against other costs, the alternative is to fix them yourself. Ruth fixes things. She has patched the plaster in the corner of the living room where the damp came through last winter. She has replaced the washer in the kitchen faucet that was dripping. She has painted the window frame in the kitchen. She has done all these things with the tools that live in the kitchen drawer, which are a hammer, a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, a small saw, and a collection of nails of various sizes in a tin that once held shoe polish. This competence is not exceptional. Most women in her building can do these things. The skills of basic household maintenance flow to whoever is home when something breaks, and the person who is home is almost always the wife. At 3:45, Jimmy and Patricia come home from school. The apartment shifts again. Jimmy has homework, which he does at the kitchen table with a focused seriousness that occasionally gets interrupted by whatever Patricia is doing, which is usually something louder and more circulatory in nature. Patricia does not have much homework in first grade, and she fills the afternoon with a kind of kinetic energy that she distributes throughout the apartment indiscriminately. Ruth starts dinner at 4:30. This is not late. Dinner in a working-class household in the 1950s is generally on the table somewhere between 5:30 and 6, time for when the husband gets home. And if you want dinner on the table at 5:30, you need to start at 4:30. What you are making tonight is a bean and vegetable soup with ham hocks, because ham hocks are inexpensive and they give the whole pot a richness that costs almost nothing extra. The beans have been soaking since this morning in a pot of cold water. You drain them, add fresh water, add the ham hock that you've been keeping in the back of the icebox all week waiting for soup day, add the carrots and the potatoes and the onion and the can of tomatoes and a bay leaf and salt and pepper, and you put on the back burner at low heat to do what soup does when left to its own devices, which is develop. While the soup develops, you make cornbread. The cornbread is from a recipe so deeply embedded in your muscle memory that you could make in the dark, which you have in fact done once during a power failure, producing a result that was entirely adequate given the circumstances. Cornmeal, flour, salt, baking powder, egg, milk, melted lard. Mix. Pour into the cast iron skillet. Into the oven. The oven needs to be watched because the oven runs slightly hot in the left rear corner and slightly cool in the front. And you have to rotate the skillet halfway through or the cornbread comes out with a personality. The smell that begins to come out of that kitchen is one of the smells that define the 1950s working class interior. Soup with ham. Cornbread baking. The onion and the bay leaf. The faint undertone of lard. It is not a sophisticated smell. It is not trying to be. It is a smell of a meal that will fill people up and warm them from the inside and cost approximately 40 cents for 5 people, which is a specific culinary achievement Ruth is attempting and which she achieves without fanfare. Earl comes home at 5:20. He hangs his coat on the hook behind the door. He sets down his lunchbox. He says something brief and general about the day. Ruth says something brief and general about Thomas and the bathroom door. They are not a household that narrates its inner lives in detail to each other over dinner. They are a household that communicates in the efficient shorthand of people who have been sharing a small space for 11 years and who know each other's patterns well enough to operate largely on inference. This is not coldness. It is not distance. It is simply what a long and busy partnership sounds like when it is working. The children cluster around Earl briefly when he comes in, which is one of the dynamics of the household. Jimmy wants to tell him something about school. Patricia wants to show him something she drew. Thomas wants to be picked up, which Earl does, swinging him up in one easy motion that makes Thomas laugh. Earl is better with the children in the evenings than he is on weekend mornings, when he needs a couple of hours of quiet before he can fully engage. Ruth has mapped this about him and accommodates it without resentment. This is how it works. Dinner is at the kitchen table, all 5 of them, which requires the table to be slightly extended with the leaf that lives against the wall in the living room. The soup is good. The cornbread is right. Jimmy eats 2 bowls. Patricia eats most of hers. Thomas creates another sculpture with his. Earl eats a full bowl with cornbread and then a second bowl because the soup is good and because he has been doing physical labor for 8 hours. Ruth eats while getting up twice to get things people have forgotten at the table. After dinner, the dishes. This is Ruth and Jimmy, because Jimmy is old enough to help with dishes, and because it is one of the contributions expected of him as the oldest child, and as a person who has eaten the food and used a bowl, and therefore has a stake in the outcome. Jimmy washes. Ruth dries. They do it in a companionable quiet. That is one of the better parts of the day. Jimmy sometimes talks during dishes. Tonight, he tells her something about a history project about the Revolutionary War that she listens to with genuine interest, because the Revolutionary War is interesting if someone is telling you about it while you're drying a soup bowl. Patricia is supposed to be doing something useful, but is in the living room with Thomas, doing something that involved a lot of dramatic narration on Patricia's part and a lot of enthusiastic, if inarticulate response on Thomas's part. The sounds from the living room suggest a theatrical production of some complexity. Earl is at the kitchen table with the newspaper and the last of the coffee, which is genuinely last by this point. The grounds have been through twice and are giving whatever remains of themselves to this final cup. The dishes are done by 7. Thomas needs his bath, which happens in the bathtub down the hall, in the window between when Mr. Martin gets home and uses the bathroom and when Mrs. Kowalski uses it for the children's bedtime bath. The window is narrow. You time it with practiced precision. Thomas in the bath is enthusiastic. The water does not stay clean. You get him dry and into his pajamas, which are onesie with snap closures, and he protests the pajamas in a purely ceremonial way before relaxing into them and beginning to indicate by the heaviness of his body that sleep is arriving whether he wants it to or not. Thomas goes down at 7:30. He is asleep before you are fully out of the room. Patricia goes to bed at 8 o'clock, after a story that Ruth reads sitting on the edge of the shared bed. The book held at the angle where both Patricia and Jimmy can see the pictures, though Jimmy would never admit he is listening to the story. He is lying on his side with his back to them, which means he is definitely listening to the story. The book is a library book. The public library is 4 blocks away, and Ruth takes the children there on Saturday mornings when the weather's reasonable, and Patricia comes home with books like they are currency, and she has been authorized to take unlimited quantities. The story tonight is about a mouse. The mouse is having various small adventures. Patricia falls asleep approximately 3/4 of the way through, which is actually the ideal outcome because it means she drifts off while the story is still in motion rather than lying awake after it ends. Jimmy, having established that he is not listening, is in fact asleep by the time Ruth closes the book. She stands in the doorway of the children's room for a moment. The room is dark except for the light from the street lamp coming through the curtain. Jimmy and Patricia are side by side in the bed, taking up more than their allocated space, as children always do, as though space is merely a suggestion when you are young and unconscious. Thomas in his crib is a small bundle of something absolutely at peace with itself. The room smells of soap and sleep, and something that is just children, an animal warmth that is completely specific to them. You close the door softly. Earl has gone to bed, or at least the bedroom, because he is up at 5:30 and he sleeps the way people sleep who need to. Ruth goes back to the kitchen. There are things to do. She sets out what she needs for tomorrow's breakfast. She checks that the beans for lunch tomorrow are soaking. She looks at the end of the bread and decides it is fine for tomorrow's sandwiches. She wipes down the stove again, because she always wipes down the stove again at night, a last word said to the kitchen before closing out for the day. She sits down at the kitchen table. It is 9:15. This is Ruth's evening. Not quite free time in any robust sense. She is tired, but it is a familiar tiredness, the kind that has a comfortable relationship with the body it occupies. She gets her mending basket and finishes something she started this afternoon, a patch on the left elbow of Jimmy's sweater that she couldn't quite finish before dinner. While she sews, she listens to the radio, which sits on the kitchen counter and which she keeps turned low so as not to wake anyone. The program is something light, a comedy show, a man telling jokes in a dry and measured voice about his wife's cooking. Ruth listens to this with the expression of someone who finds the domestic incompetence of fictional wives mildly amusing in the specific way that it's amusing when someone is confused about something you understand very well. The radio is one of the genuine pleasures of Ruth's evening. It is company without demanding anything. It fills the quiet of the kitchen with human voices, which is something she doesn't always have enough of during the long stretches of the day when it is just her and Thomas and the sounds of the building. By 1953, television is beginning its steady march into American living rooms, but not into Ruth's. A television costs approximately $250 in 1953, which is 4 weeks of Earl's entire paycheck before anything is paid for. Television is a middle-class and aspirational purchase. It is something people in better apartments on better streets are starting to have. Ruth is aware of television in an abstract way, in the same way she is aware of many things that exist outside the boundaries of what her life currently makes room for. She is not resentful of this. She would like a television the way she would like a larger apartment or a washing machine or a kitchen without cracked linoleum, which is to say she would like it without actively suffering for its absence. There are enough things to think about. The radio fills in. At around 9:45, the mending finished, the kitchen quiet, the radio having transitioned to something instrumental and even calmer. Ruth does a thing she does every evening. She goes through her mental accounting of the day. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. She simply thinks. In the practical way, she thinks about everything, about what happened and what needs to happen tomorrow, and whether anything went wrong that needs handling. The bathroom door latch is now installed. Good. She needs to return the library book this week, or it will be overdue. She needs to ask Mrs. Kowalski about the church meeting Thursday, because she wasn't sure if it was Thursday or Friday. Earl mentioned something about overtime next week. She should adjust the grocery list accordingly if he is working more, because he eats more when he is working more, which is logical, and also because if there's overtime, there will be slightly more money, which means she might be able to get the chicken she has been wanting to make for about 3 weeks. The chicken is genuinely aspirational at this point. This mental ledger has no paper. It has no spreadsheet. It has no app. It is simply Ruth's mind, running its end-of-day audit with the competence of someone who has been doing this for 11 years and who understands the difference between what is urgent and what can wait and what can probably be let go. This competence is not visible to anyone. It is not recorded anywhere. It simply happens every night at 9:45 in a kitchen with cracked linoleum and a hum from the refrigerator, and it keeps the household together. She gets up. She puts the mending basket away. She turns off the radio in the middle of a note. She goes to the bathroom in the hallway, which is quiet now. She washes her face with cold water from the tap. She puts on the Jergens hand lotion. She brushes her teeth with the Apana toothpaste that sits on the small shelf above the sink. The toothbrush is beginning to fray. She has been meaning to replace it. She makes a note of this for Saturday's errands. She goes back to the apartment and into the bedroom. Earl is asleep. She can tell by the quality of the silence, which is different from the silence of a room where someone is awake. She gets changed in the dark, moving quietly, because changing in the dark without waking anyone is another skill in the catalog of domestic competencies she has never been asked to list. She gets into bed on her side. She lies on her back for a moment and looks up at the ceiling. The ceiling has a water stain in the corner that appeared last winter and that the landlord has been promising to look at. It is a map-shaped stain, irregular around the edges, darker at the center. She has looked at the stain many times. She knows its geography. She turns onto her side. Her back, which has been conducting a quiet campaign of protest all day, settles into familiar negotiation with the mattress. The mattress has a slight depression on her side. She had been sleeping on this side of this mattress for 11 years, and the depression is a record of all those years, every night of them shaped into the springs. The sounds of the building at night are different from the sounds during the day. The building breathes differently. The pipes that tick and complain in the daytime settle into a softer register. The sound of the Kowalski radio through the wall has stopped. The street outside is quieter, though never entirely quiet, because the city is always doing something at some frequency. Ruth is asleep by 10:15. She will be awake at 5:45. But before we close out Ruth's day, before we let her rest, it is worth understanding that what we have followed today is one version of one day in one woman's life. Because the 1950s, for the women living in and below the comfortable waterline, held enormous variety that a single story can only suggest. In the rural South, in the tenant farming communities of Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, a black woman's day in 1953 began even earlier than Ruth's, and it ended later, and it contained dimensions that Ruth's day did not. It contained the additional labor of segregation, the additional mathematics of knowing that the store you need to go to is not the nearest store, but the store you are permitted to use. The additional planning required to move through a world that has organized itself legally and practically to remind you of your designated position at every available opportunity. If you are Luella, who is 38 years old and lives in a 2-room house in a small farming community in the Delta, your morning starts at 4:30 because there is no choice. The cotton does not wait for 5:45. The mule does not wait. The children need feeding before first light because they will be in the field by sunrise, the older ones, even the ones who should be in school but whose attendance is irregular because the family needs a labor and because the school for black children in this county is inadequate and far, and because there is a calculation that Luella and her husband Louis make every season about what the children's lives require immediately versus what they will require eventually. Luella's house has no running water. The water comes from a well in the yard. Every bucket of water used in that house is a bucket that someone walked a well and carried back. Cooking, washing, drinking, cleaning. All of it bucket. The distance from the house to the well is approximately 40 feet, and those 40 feet are walked many times a day, every single day, in all weather, all year. This fact does not appear in any 1950s advertisement. It does not appear in any pastoral description of rural life. It is simply a physical reality of extraordinary ordinariness that shapes every moment of Luella's day. The house has 2 rooms. The main room serves as kitchen, living space, and in cold weather, the place where the family gathers around the stove. The back room is where everyone sleeps. Luella and Louis have 5 children. The children range in age from 16 Marcus down to 4, who is called Pearl, because Luella's mother said she looked like a pearl when she was born, and nobody has ever called her anything else. They all sleep in the back room on 2 beds. The arrangement is close. It is very close. There is no privacy except the privacy of being so tired that you stop being aware of what is immediately next to you. Luella's kitchen is a wood stove, a table, and 3 shelves. The wood stove heats the room and cooks the food and heats the water and dries the laundry in winter. The wood stove is her whole domestic economy in a single object. She knows it the way you know something you depend on entirely. She knows how it draws in the morning when the weather is from the west. She knows how long to let the ash build up before it starts to affect the temperature. She knows the sound it makes when the flue needs to be cleaned, a slightly thickened draft sound. That means you should deal with it soon. Breakfast in Luella's house is grits, because grits are what there is in the morning, supplemented by whatever is available, which varies by season and by how the month is going. In October, there might be sweet potato. There might be fat back, a slice or 2 fried in the pan. There might be eggs if the hens are cooperating, which they do and don't according to their own schedule, without regard for anyone's preferences. She cooks for 7 people. The cooking takes place in the 4:30 to 5:30 hour when the dark is still solid, and the only light in the kitchen is from the kerosene lamp on the table. The lamp puts out a yellow circle of light and smells of kerosene in a way that is simply the smell of that room in the early morning, inseparable from the idea of that room. She has cooked in this light so many times that she does not need much of it. Her hands know where the bowl is. Her hands know how much salt. The children wake to the sound and the smell of cooking. They come in one by one. The older ones already aware that they need to move quickly. The younger ones still moving at the pace of children who have not yet integrated the day's requirements. They eat. Luella eats standing up, the same as Ruth eats standing up, which is something that nobody orchestrated, but which seems to happen in busy households across every era and geography with remarkable consistency. It is as though the person doing the cooking has already spent all their sitting down time, while cooking and standing up is the logical continuation. The men, Louis, and the older boys go to the field. The younger children, Pearl and the 7-year-old whose name is Robert, stay at home. In the fall, in cotton picking season, everyone goes who is old enough to be useful. But in the after-harvest weeks, there is a different rhythm. There is the next season to prepare for. There is the maintenance and repair work. There is a firewood to be cut and split and stacked, which Louis and Marcus handle. And there is everything else, which Luella handles. Luella's laundry is done in a cast-iron pot in the yard. She builds a fire under it. The water, which she has carried from the well, heats slowly. She uses homemade lye soap, a bar of the thick, rough, brown soap that she makes herself from fat and lye twice a year, a process that is not quite as romantic as it sounds and involves caustic chemicals and several hours of stirring, and the specific vigilance of someone working with something that will damage what it touches if it touches it carelessly. The soap works. It takes the farm out of farm clothes with thoroughness that gentler soaps do not achieve. She washes the clothes with a washboard, the same as Ruth. She wrings them by hand. Because the wringer she uses is a hand wringer, 2 rollers attached to a frame that you run the wet cloth through, turning the handle with your free hand while you feed the cloth with the other. The wringer takes the water out more efficiently than wringing by hand, but it still requires sustained effort, and the clothes that come out of it are still damp, not dry, and they have to be hung on the line to finish. The line runs between 2 trees in the yard. In October, the air is cool enough that things dry slowly. She calculates this. She knows that the shirts need to go up first because they take longer. She knows that the sheets need to be spread fully, or they come down damp in the middle. She knows which way the light wind comes from and hangs the clothes so that they are open to it. This is expertise. It is embodied knowledge developed over years. It is not written down anywhere. It belongs to her. Luella also grows much of what her family eats. The kitchen garden is hers, behind the house, a rectangle of earth that she has been tending for many years. It holds sweet potatoes, which keep well through winter, collard greens, which get sweeter after the first frost, dried beans of several kinds, field peas, onions. In summer there are tomatoes and okra and squash. The garden does not replace the need to buy things, but it dramatically reduces it, and in the thin weeks near the end of the month, the kitchen garden is the difference between meals that are adequate and meals that are not. It is not decoration. It is not hobby. It is infrastructure. She preserves in August and September for the months ahead. Glass jars on the shelf above the back room door hold the results of those weeks. Tomatoes, green beans, peaches when there are peaches, blackberry jam from the canes along the fence. The canning is done on the wood stove in the August heat, which means canning in Luella's house happens in conditions that can only be described as punishing. The stove has to be hot enough to seal the jars properly, which means the kitchen is very hot indeed, and August in the Delta does not provide any relief from the outside. And the two-room house has exactly the cross ventilation you would expect from two windows and a door that you have to leave open to survive the temperature. Luella cans anyway. Of course she does. The alternative is not canning. The medical reality of Luella's life in 1953 is more severe than Ruth's, and Ruth's is already more severe than the Comfortable America version suggests. The nearest hospital that will treat black patients is 22 miles away. The nearest doctor who sees black patients is 12 miles away in the county seat. The cost of a doctor's visit is $3, which is not small. When someone is sick in Luella's house, the first resource is her own knowledge. The second resource is the knowledge of her mother or her aunt or the older women in the community. And the third resource, the one that requires a particular threshold of severity before it becomes viable, is the trip to the county seat. She knows which plants grow along the creek bottom and what they are good for. She knows how to draw out fever with cold compresses and how to manage croup with steam and how to dress a cut so it doesn't go bad. She knows these things because she grew up with a grandmother who knew them, and that grandmother grew up with a grandmother who knew them, and at every generation this knowledge has been the difference between getting through something and not getting through it. This is not folk medicine as a charming alternative to modern medicine. This is folk medicine as the only medicine available. When Lewis cut his hand badly on a piece of sheet metal 2 winters ago, Luella cleaned a wound, packed it with a poultice of plantain leaves, which has genuine antimicrobial properties, bandaged it tightly, and watched it for infection for 2 weeks while making him rest it as much as a man can rest a hand while still needing to work. The hand healed. It healed because she managed it correctly, and also because Lewis was healthy enough to heal, and also because infections that don't get treated adequately don't always resolve that fortunately. She is aware of this. She is aware that they have been lucky in some things, and she is aware that luck is not a plan. The church that Luella's family attends is the center of something that has no equivalent in Ruth's urban neighborhood, because the church in this rural black community is not just the place you go on Sunday. It is the school board for the community school, such as it is. It is the mutual aid society, the emergency fund, the information network, the space where civic organization happens in conditions where civic organization through formal channels is not available. When a family's house burns down, the church organizes a response. When there is a legal matter, the church connects people to the few resources that exist. When there is a funeral, which in communities with limited medical access happens more than it should, the church handles everything. Luella is in the church network the way a telephone operator is in the phone system. She knows everyone. She knows who needs what. She knows who can provide what. She is the person who organizes the food when there is a bereavement, and the person who shows up first when there is a difficulty, and the person who knows, without being told, when someone is struggling in a way that requires community response rather than just individual sympathy. This is work. It is real work. It is work that has never been counted in any economic ledger or measured in any productivity study. It is the work of maintaining a community that needs maintaining. It takes hours. It takes knowledge of human beings. It takes a specific combination of warmth and practicality that means you show up with food and stay to help, but you also don't say the wrong thing. Back in the city, in Ruth's building, there's a version of the same network, smaller and more urban, but just as real. The women in the building have a relationship with each other that functions as a mutual aid system without being named that. They watch each other's children. They lend things, a cup of flour, a bottle of milk, a needle with the right color thread. They know when Mrs. Kowalski is having a bad week with her back, and they adjust accordingly. They know when the Martin girl is in some kind of trouble that her mother doesn't want to talk about, and they provide the available form of support, which is presence and discretion. They share information. Which store has the better price this week? Which doctor in the neighborhood will let you pay over time? What is happening with the landlord's nephew who has been making himself too present in the building lately? This network is maintained largely by the women. It requires constant attention and maintenance and social intelligence. It is unpaid. It is invisible. It is essential. On the other side of the country, let us step briefly into a different kind of working class poverty, a different geography. In the mill towns of North Carolina and South Carolina, women like Dorothy work the early shift at the textile mill. Dorothy is 26. She is not married, which is unusual for her age and social context. But she came close once and it did not work out. And she is now not sure if it will happen. And she has come something like peace with that uncertainty while still hoping. Dorothy lives with her mother and her sister, who has 2 children, in a mill house. Mill houses are company housing that textile companies built for their workers. Small wooden houses arranged in rows close to mill, sold or rented to workers at rates slightly below market because the company preferred its workers to live close and to owe it the rent. The arrangement is efficient from the company's perspective and produces a very specific kind of community among the workers who share it, a community both tight-knit and slightly precarious, because a house and a job are connected, and if you lose one, you are in danger of losing the other. Dorothy's shift starts at 6 in the morning. She is out of the house at 5:35. She walks to the mill in the dark with 2 other women from her street, women she has known since childhood, women with whom she is friends in a comprehensive way of people whose entire lives have overlapped in a small geography. They talk while they walk, or they are quiet while they walk, depending on the morning. The morning tells you which kind of morning it is by the quality of the air. The mill is a vast building, several stories of brick with windows that run floor to ceiling along each side. Inside, in the weaving room where Dorothy works, the noise is extraordinary. Dozens of power looms running simultaneously produce a volume of sound that is technically damaging to the hearing. Dorothy and all the women who work alongside her have a degree of hearing loss that varies by how long they have been working in the mill. Dorothy has been working in the mill since she was 17. She has been working in the mill for 9 years. She reads lips better than she used to, not deliberately, but as an adaptive response to spending so much time in conditions where lip reading is more reliable than hearing. The looms are fed continuously. The work of running a power loom is physically easier than working one by hand, but it still requires constant attention, the management of thread tension, the monitoring of the fabric as it builds up, the swift response when something snags or breaks, the physical movement back and forth along the machine that adds up to several miles of walking per shift. Dorothy's feet hurt by 9 in the morning. Her feet have been hurting by 9 in the morning since she was 17. Her feet now hurt in a baseline way that she no longer registers as news. The cotton lint floats in the air of a weaving room like a gentle permanent snowfall of white fluff. It settles on clothing and skin and hair. It gathers in the corners of the room. It gets breathed in. The workers call it byssinosis, or some of the older ones do, though that medical term is not widely in use yet. What they call it more commonly is brown lung, which is a term that accurately describes what happens to a respiratory system that spends decades breathing cotton dust. It is a gradual process. You do not notice it year by year. You notice it at some point in the future, when climbing stairs takes more breath than it used to. Dorothy does not think about this. She thinks about the end of the shift. She thinks about what is for lunch. She thinks, during the long stretches of monitoring that the loom requires, about small and medium things. The letter she got from her cousin in Baltimore. The price of the fabric she saw in the window of the store on Main Street that she cannot afford but that she has been thinking about because it was a beautiful deep green, and she has wanted something in that green for a long time. At 12 o'clock, she has 30 minutes. She eats from a tin she brought from home, which holds a biscuit and some leftover beans and a piece of pound cake from Sunday that has been kept carefully. She eats it in the break room with the other women, and the break room is where the full social life of the mill gets conducted in these 30-minute windows. Gossip, information, comfort, strategy, humor. The kind of conversation that women have when they have very little time and a great deal to say. The afternoon shift is the same as the morning shift with the added weight of the day already behind you. At 2:30, Dorothy's shift ends. She walks home in the opposite direction, in the afternoon light, which is usually different from the dawn light in a way that feels meaningful even if you can't precisely articulate why. She changes out her work clothes, which are impregnated with lint, and helps her mother start dinner, and tends to her sister's children for a while, because her sister works evenings at the cafe, and the children need managing. This is Dorothy's day. It has 2 jobs in it, the paid one at the mill and the unpaid one at home. Neither is optional. Now, the question of health and medicine deserves a longer stay because the health of working-class American women in 1953 is one of the starkest divergences from a mid-century image. The image suggests healthy, well-nourished women living in clean modern homes with regular medical attention. The reality, for a significant portion of the population, is quite different. Ruth has a family doctor. She sees him rarely because the visit costs money and because minor things are managed at home and because there is a calculation that runs constantly in her mind about what is serious enough to warrant the cost and the inconvenience. The last time she went to the doctor was for Thomas's 1-year checkup, which she was told by several people she absolutely had to do. Before that, it was when Jimmy broke his wrist falling off the back fence 2 years ago and she had to take him to the hospital, where the emergency visit cost $12.50. Which came out of the savings account and took 4 months to replace. Ruth herself has not seen a doctor since Thomas was born. She delivered Thomas at the hospital, unlike Jimmy and Patricia, who were delivered at home by a midwife, because by 1951 the hospital had become more available to working-class families and the medical community had broadly moved to discouraging home births. The hospital birth was expensive and impersonal, and she was in a war with 4 other women, and the nurses were kind but very busy. She spent 2 days in the hospital after Thomas was born, which was a recommended stay, and then came home to an apartment with 2 other children and a husband who needed his lunch made. Her teeth need attention. She knows this. There's a tooth on the upper right side that has been intermittently bothering her for 6 months. She has not gone to the dentist because the dentist costs more than the doctor, and also because the dentist is something you do when the situation is escalated to undeniable urgency rather than intermittent bother. The tooth has not yet escalated. She is aware that this is a kind of calculation that tends to resolve itself in expensive ways eventually, but the present moment has other priorities. Women in Ruth's position frequently manage their own minor health concerns with the resources available to them, which in 1953 include a medicine cabinet containing aspirin, a bottle of mercurochrome for cuts, some cotton wool, a jar of Vicks Vapor Rub, which has an almost cultural status in working-class medicine of the era as a treatment for any respiratory condition whatsoever, and a thermometer. The thermometer is important. A thermometer is the tool of maternal health care surveillance. Ruth can look at the thermometer and tell you exactly how worried she is. Below 100, watchful. Between 100 and 101, attentive and managing. Above 101, the calculation shifts. Her period comes with cramps that in another era might receive medical attention, and that she treats with a heating pad and aspirin and the management of everything else while being moderately uncomfortable. There is a small pamphlet from her doctor's office about women's health matters, the kind that existed in 1953, and that spoke about female physiology in a tone that was clinical in the most distancing possible way, as if the women reading it were learning about the operations of something fairly distant from themselves rather than their own bodies. She read it once when Jimmy was small, and found it somewhat less useful than talking to her mother. Her mother, in fact, is Ruth's primary medical resource in a great many situations. Her mother is 63, living in a building 3 miles away, and she knows things about managing the health of a family that have been accumulated over decades of raising 4 children in circumstances similar to Ruth's. Her mother's knowledge is neither fully scientific nor fully folk medicine. It is practical empiricism. She knows what tends to work from what she has seen work. She distinguishes between things that are probably going to be fine and things that are probably not. She is right with a regularity that would satisfy a clinical trial, though no clinical trial has ever been conducted about this specific competence. The question of women's health in the 1950s also means a question of reproductive health. And here the working class reality diverges from the official story quite dramatically. Contraception in 1953 is a complicated subject. The birth control pill does not exist yet. It will be approved by the FDA in 1960. Before that, the options are barrier methods, which are legal and available but require a level of medical consultation and cost that creates a practical barrier for many women. Natural family planning, which is the only method the Catholic Church endorses, and which a substantial portion of Ruth's neighborhood practices, because it is what the Church endorses, and because the Church is the moral authority of the neighborhood. And the other methods, the ones that exist but are not legally supported, and that women discuss in particular privacy of close female friendship with frankness that would surprise anyone who believes the 1950s were universally demure about these things. Ruth has 3 children. She would prefer not to have a 4th, at least not yet. She and Earl have navigated this in the way that couples in their position navigate it, imperfectly and with results that are not entirely in their control. She has spoken about this with her mother. She has spoken about it with Mrs. Kowalski. She has not spoken about it with anyone at the church, because the church's position is clear, and she has found a way to hold the church's position and her own practical reality in the same mind, without having to resolve them into a single statement. This is a very 1950s thing to do. A great deal of the decade's social reality was managed by holding contradictions in the same mind without resolution. The advertisement said one thing, and the kitchen table said another, and the women at the kitchen table were remarkably clear-eyed about the gap between them. If you step back further and look at the working-class landscape of 1953 America as a whole, one of the things that stands out is the astonishing variety of women's work lives. Ruth in the city, Luella in the Delta, Dorothy in the mill town. But there are also the women in the coal communities of Appalachia, where the mine is the town's entire economic reason for existing, and where the women's job is to manage everything that is not the mine, which is everything. To keep the house while the man is underground. To listen for the whistle. To know what the whistle means. There are the women in the cannery towns of California's Central Valley, following the harvest from crop to crop, living in labor camps with rows of tin-roof barracks, working in the fields alongside their husbands and children, earning piece wages that depend on speed and on the weather and on whether the foreman is fair, which he sometimes is and sometimes is not. These women are mostly from Mexico, some from the Philippines, some from the communities of black workers who came to California from the South after the war. They carry their household economies in their heads the same as Ruth. They mend the same clothes with the same care. They cook on camp stoves with the same efficiency of people for whom food is a production rather than a purchase. They are in America, and they are completely outside the image of 1950s America simultaneously. There are the women in the Navajo Nation in Arizona and New Mexico, weaving rugs on handlooms that their grandmothers taught them to use, managing households in conditions that are both ancient in structure and actively impoverished in a particular way that reservation life in 1953 imposes, living with a specific burden of being a nation within a nation and the object of federal policy whose consistency has been its indifference. There are the women in the public housing projects in cities like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, buildings that in 1953 are still relatively new, sometimes still clean, before the combination of underfunding and overcrowding and deliberate policy neglect that will turn them into what they will eventually become. These women are navigating a very specific form of dense urban working class life, where the proximity is extreme and the community is intense and the hierarchy of the building itself is a social world all its own. There are the women in the small towns of the Midwest, the farm wives who are not farming in a romantic pastoral sense, but farming in the fully commercial agricultural sense, which means participating in a business that is subject to weather and commodity prices and debt cycles, and that can go from sustainable to catastrophic in a single bad harvest. These women do the books as often as not. They know the numbers. They know what the bank's interest rate is on the operating loan, and they know how many bushels of corn, at what price it takes to service that loan, and what happens if the price drops below that threshold, which it does, periodically, with the regularity of an unwelcome guest. And then there are the women who are invisible to almost everyone in 1953, even by the standards of invisibility that apply to the others. The women doing domestic service. The women, predominantly black women in the South and Northeast, working in the houses of wealthier white families, cooking and cleaning and laundering, and caring for children in households not their own, while their own children are cared for by someone else, or by older siblings, or by neighbors, or by themselves. These women work all week in someone else's kitchen, and then go home on their day off to work in their own kitchen, without any of it being called work in any official sense. The domestic worker in 1953 is excluded from protections of the National Labor Relations Act. She has no right to organize. She has no minimum wage protection under federal law. She has no unemployment insurance, no Social Security coverage in most cases. She enters through the back door because that is the door she is expected to use. She is paid something between $8 and $15 a week, depending on the household, depending on the negotiation, depending on geography. She refers to the woman of the house as Mrs. Whatever and is referred to by her first name. This asymmetry of address is small and enormous simultaneously. Her name might be Ella. Ella is 44 years old. She has been doing domestic work since she was 18. She has watched children grow up in houses where she worked, and she knows them better in the daily ordinary sense than their parents do, because she is there when the parents are not. She knows which child is having a hard time at school because she is there when the child comes home. She knows which marriage is in trouble because she hears the dinnertime silences. She knows where the good silver is and where the medicine cabinet key is hidden and where the whiskey bottle moves to when company is coming and what the financial anxiety level of the household is from the particular way Mrs. Whatever talks about the grocery order. Ella carries this knowledge with the discretion of a professional, which is what she is. And she goes home at the end of the day to the 2 rooms she rents in a boarding house, where she cooks her own dinner on a hot plate and writes a letter to her daughter in Georgia, who is being raised by Ella's mother, because the work is in the city, and the city is no place for a child without a stable home, and she will bring her daughter to live with her when she can afford a bigger room, which she is working toward, which she has been working toward for several years now, and which she will eventually achieve. This is Ella's day. It has its own dignity and its own loneliness and its own set of calculations. What all of these women share, across their vast differences in geography and race and household composition, is the experience performing an extraordinary volume of labor that is categorized by the economic and cultural systems of 1953 as either secondary or invisible. The housewife's labor is categorized as non-economic, because no money changes hands, a categorization so logically confused that it is remarkable it survived as long as it did. The domestic worker's labor is categorized as low value because the person performing it has been systematically positioned as low value. The agricultural worker's labor is categorized as unskilled because the skills involved in it are not the skills that 1953 America is inclined to recognize. The women performing this labor mostly know better. They know what they do. They know how hard it is. They know what would fall apart if they stopped doing it. They know this in a way that you know something that has never been formally acknowledged, which is quietly and with a kind of wry clarity that does not require external validation to remain accurate. Let's return to Ruth now, because she has woken up again, and it is Tuesday, and Tuesday is laundry day. Laundry day deserves its own universe of attention, because laundry in 1953, for a working-class family, without an automatic washing machine, is genuinely one of the most physically demanding regular activities of the domestic week. If you have never done laundry without a machine, you may not fully appreciate what the washing machine removed from human life when it became widely available, which it did not do for everyone all at once. The washing machine removed hours of sustained physical effort. It removed the specific pain of wringing by hand. It removed the standing. It removed the steam. It removed the need to heat enormous quantities of water. The washing machine is, from a domestic labor perspective, one of the most significant labor-saving devices in the history of household technology, And the women who got them understood this at a gut level with an immediacy that no technology writer of the era was quite equipped to capture. Ruth's laundry process on Tuesday morning begins at 6:45, after the children are at school and Earl's at work, and begins with filling pots on the stove. The laundromat 2 blocks away has machines, which she uses for the large items, the sheets, and the heavy wool blankets. But the everyday clothes, the shirts and pants and underwear and socks and dresses and children's things, she does at home in a sink and in a galvanized tub she keeps under the kitchen counter. The tub comes out on Tuesdays. It is a serious object. It has the weight of purpose. You sort first. White things separate from dark things. Children's things together. Earl's work clothes separate from everything else because they carry a particular industrial residue from the factory that requires more aggressive treatment. Delicate things. Though in Ruth's house delicate things are a small category, separate and handled with more care. The water in the tub has to be heated by filling it with pots of hot water from the stove. This takes about 4 trips from the stove to the tub with a large pot of water each time. The tub gets to a temperature that is hot enough to be effective but cool enough not to ruin the clothes, which is a temperature you gauge with your hand, and which you know through experience rather than thermometer. The soap, a bar of laundry soap worked into a lather, goes in. The clothes go in. The washing is agitation by hand. You push the clothes through the soapy water, rub fabric against fabric. Work the areas that are most soiled against the washboard. Your hands are in the hot water for extended periods. This is why Ruth's hands look like they do. This is why the Jergens is not entirely sufficient. The washboard does the heavy work on the heavy stains, but the rest is manual pressure applied with sustained effort. A child's shirt is not difficult. Earl's work pants, which are stiff with the accumulated residue of the factory floor, are a different matter. You work them against the board until the water runs gray, and then you know you are making progress. The wringer, a hand-crank device clamped to the side of the tub, takes the washed items and removes most of the water through the pressure of 2 rollers. You feed the item in with one hand and crank with the other, and the item comes out flattened and considerably less wet than it needs rinsing. You fill a second tub with clean water, colder than the wash water, and run everything through it. Then wring again. The whole process for one load takes approximately 90 minutes of sustained effort. Ruth does at least 2 loads on laundry day, sometimes 3 if the children have been particularly active. By the time she is done with all the washing and wringing and rinsing, it is afternoon, and the apartment smells of soap and the steam that has been rising from the hot water since morning, and Ruth's back is doing the thing it does on laundry day specifically, which has announced itself with a particular quality of complaint that is somewhat more pointed than its usual contribution. The hanging. Things go on the drying rack near the radiator in winter, or on the clothesline out the window in better weather. She has a system for this too. Things that need to maintain their shape, get hung with care, pulling the seam straight, smoothing the fabric over the drying form it will take. Will items, which can felt and distort if you're not careful, get laid flat on a towel. Children's things get hung, so they can be taken down and put on a child quickly if needed. Everything goes up in an order that reflects when it will be needed and how long it takes to dry. The ironing. There's ironing because in the 1950s, wrinkle-free fabric technology is in its early stages, and most cotton and linen clothing requires ironing. And in a household where the husband goes to a factory and the children go to school and the family goes to church, the ironing is a weekly commitment of several hours. Ruth's iron is electric, an improvement over the flat iron that had to be heated on the stove, and she does the ironing in the late afternoon while the children are home from school, and Thomas is in whatever configuration of activity and supervision the late afternoon requires. She irons Earl's shirts first because they are the most important, then the children's school clothes, then her own things. She is good at ironing. She is good at it in the way she is good at most of these tasks, which is efficiently and without wasted effort. She irons a collar first on a shirt, then the front placket, then the shoulders and the back, then the sleeves. If you watch her do it, there is a rhythm to it, a particular choreography that is almost beautiful in its efficiency. Each shirt takes under 5 minutes. The pile of shirts at the beginning becomes a row of pressed, hung shirts over the course of the afternoon. Thomas, who has been awake from his nap for the last portion of the ironing session, has concerns about the ironing board. He has circled it several times from a respectful distance, aware somehow that it is hot, and that hot is a category thing that requires caution, though he is not yet entirely sure why. He has been told about hot things. The concept is still more abstract to him than it will be when he eventually touches something that is definitively hot, after which it will be the most concrete concept in his vocabulary. For now he circles and watches. You keep the iron cord away from him. You keep one eye on his proximity at all times. When the children come home from school, the kitchen smells of hot cloth and steam iron. Jimmy puts his books on the table and immediately asks what is for dinner. Patricia comes in behind him and looks at the iron pile and picks up her own dress from it and says something approving about it, which is gratifying if not entirely surprising, given that it is her favorite dress. She carries it to the bedroom. You say something about hanging it up. You know she will put it over the back of the chair. This is a transaction you have conducted many times. Dinner on Tuesday is different from dinner on Monday. Ruth plans her meals with the same efficiency she applies to everything else. Not in the sense that she sits down and writes a menu, but in the sense that she holds in her mind a rough trajectory of what will use what will stretch what makes sense on what day. Monday's bean soup was substantial. Tuesday's dinner is a simpler thing. Macaroni and cheese, made from scratch with the macaroni from a box and the block of cheddar and the milk and the flour and butter for the sauce. It is a dish that Patricia especially loves and that Thomas eats with enthusiasm, and that costs about 23 cents for the whole family. It takes about 25 minutes to make, and it is warm and filling and rich with cheese. The kitchen smells different tonight than it did last night. The macaroni and the cheese sauce smell of comfort and simplicity. There is bread from the day-old loaf. Earl eats heartily. He always eats heartily after days that have been physically demanding, which is most days. He is not a complicated man about food. He likes what he likes, and he appreciates it being good. And it is almost always good because Ruth cooks well, which is to say she cooks efficiently and practically with results that are consistently pleasing within the constraints of what she is working with. This is not a small achievement. Cooking well on a tight budget and on a tight schedule, and with children underfoot, is a genuine skill that gets undervalued partly because it is common among women who have had to develop it. After dinner, after dishes, after Thomas's bath and the children's bedtime, after the radio and the mending and the last kitchen wipe down, Ruth again sits at the table in the evening quiet. Tuesday is slightly different from Monday in the evening. On Tuesday evenings, she sometimes writes a letter. She writes to her sister in another city, or to her cousin, or occasionally to a school friend she has not seen in years, but with whom she maintains a correspondence because it feels important to maintain it. Because the act of writing to someone is a form of keeping them in your life, and keeping yourself in theirs. The letters are written on stationery she bought at the 5 and dime store, a pad of plain white paper with a little decorative border. She writes in cursive that is slightly more careful than her everyday handwriting, a handwriting that is clear and slightly formal. The handwriting of someone who was taught by a teacher who valued good cursive and who absorbed that value. She writes about the children, and about what is happening in the neighborhood, and about the church meeting, and about whatever she is thinking about. She does not write about the things that are difficult in the comprehensive way they are difficult, because the letter is not the place for that, and also because some things are too ambient to narrate. You don't write, "I am tired" in a letter. You write, "Jimmy got a good mark on his history project." You write, "Thomas is starting to say more words." You write, "Patricia made me laugh the other day by announcing at dinner that she is not going to eat anything orange for the rest of her life." You write the things that are real and ordinary and will make the person on the other end feel close to you. The letter goes into an envelope. The stamp is 4 cents. She puts it by the door where she will remember it tomorrow. 4 cents. The postage stamp as a specific artifact of 1953 daily life is worth a moment's attention. The stamp in 1953 is a connection to a nationwide system of communication that is available to essentially everyone at a cost of 4 cents. Which is a price point low enough that even the most stretched household can usually manage a letter if it needs to. The letter itself takes 1 to 3 days to arrive, depending on distance. It is the internet of the 1950s in the sense that it is the distributed communications network available to ordinary people. Unlike the internet, it requires you to know what you want to say before you say it, to commit your thoughts to paper, to address and seal, and walk the envelope to a mailbox. These requirements have a particular effect on the texture of communication. Letters from 1953, when you read them today, have a considered quality. They say things with an attention to permanence that a text message does not attempt. Ruth's letters have this quality. She is not a literary writer. She is not trying to be. But she is a person who pays attention to things and who describes them carefully, and her letters to her sister are full of the close observation of daily life that makes them more interesting when her sister reads them than she probably knows. The week has rhythms beyond the daily ones. Saturday brings Earl home for the full day, and the dynamic of the household shifts with his presence. He is not unkind about being home, but he occupies space differently than the children do, takes up more of the apartment's social atmosphere. He wants the newspaper and the quiet to read it. He sometimes helps with things around the apartment, the heavier repair jobs that have been waiting. He sometimes plays with the children with a focused attention that he is not able to sustain very long before he needs a retreat to his newspaper. Ruth adjusts to all of this with the ease of familiarity. Saturday afternoon is the library trip if the weather is reasonable. Ruth takes the children to the public library, which is one of her genuine pleasures as well as theirs. The public library is free. Let that sit for a moment. In a life where most things carry a cost, the public library offers an unlimited quantity of books for free, which is either one of the great cultural bargains of civilization or a miracle, depending on your perspective. And Ruth's perspective is something close to the latter. She uses a library with the enthusiasm of a person who grew up with access to few books and who discovered the public library as a young adult and never got over the revelation. She comes home with something for each of the children and something for herself, usually a novel, sometimes a biography, occasionally a book about something she is curious about, gardening or cooking or history. She reads for 20 minutes to half an hour every night after the mending and before the light goes out, because the 20 minutes are hers in a way the rest of the day is not, and she uses them accordingly. Sunday is church. The family is Catholic, which means Sunday Mass at 8:30, the whole family, dressed in the best they have, which for Ruth means a dress she bought last Easter and which she keeps for occasions, a navy blue dress with a white collar. The shoes are polished on Saturday night. The children's hair is managed with varying degrees of cooperation. Thomas's hair cooperates because he is 2 and has not developed hair opinions. Patricia's hair cooperates on a schedule that has nothing to do with the calendar. The church is a large brick building with high ceilings and windows of colored glass that catch the morning light and throw it onto the congregation in blue and red and gold. And it smells of candles and incense and old stone in a particular way that Catholic churches smell the world over, a smell that has been building since the church was constructed in 1908, and that has been added by every Sunday of every year since. Ruth finds the smell comforting in a way that she couldn't entirely explain. It is the smell of continuity, of something larger and longer than any individual week. The social life of the church extends beyond the Sunday Mass into the week in ways that are important to Ruth's daily life. The women's auxiliary meets every other Thursday. The church runs a small pantry that provides food to families who need it, and Ruth has both received from this pantry during a bad period 2 winters ago and donated to it when things were better. And both of these transactions happen without ceremony or record, which is how they were meant to happen. The church also organizes a Christmas drive, which provides presents to children in the parish whose families cannot provide them, and Ruth organizes a distribution list for a floor of the building, which requires knowing discreetly which families need and what the children's ages are and what the budget allows. The church is a social infrastructure. The bar on the corner is a different kind of social infrastructure, one that is Earl's primarily, though it bleeds into the household in various ways. Not all of them complicated. Earl goes to the bar on Friday evening sometimes, and occasionally on Saturday, and he comes home having spent some amount that Ruth doesn't always know and that Earl sometimes understates when asked, and she has learned to manage this piece of the household economy with a particular combination of pragmatism and private frustration. Earl drinks, but he is not a drunk. He is a man who drinks more than Ruth would prefer, and less than several of her neighbors' husbands, and she has placed him somewhere on the spectrum, and made her peace with it in a complicated way that peace gets made with things you can't change. There are women in the building and on the street for whom the drinking is not manageable and whose lives are shaped by it in ways more severe than Ruth's. The woman upstairs has a husband who comes home Friday nights in a condition that means she has learned to have the children in bed before he arrives. The Martin daughter, whose singing in the morning bathroom is generally cheerful, had a father whose drinking was the reason the family moved 3 times in 5 years, and you can see, in the way the daughter carries herself, the residue of that particular kind of childhood. These things are known in the building without being said in the open, known in the way that neighbors know things about each other when the walls are thin and the lives are close together. Domestic violence in the 1950s working-class neighborhood is a subject that the decade's official culture almost entirely refuses to address, and this refusal is itself a form of policy, because what cannot be named cannot be helped. There are women on Ruth Street who are in situations that would today be recognized as abusive, and that in 1953 are categorized as, at best, private marital difficulties, and at worst, simply how things are. The police, when called, almost always treat it as a domestic matter, and leave without arresting anyone. The woman has no legal mechanism to compel the man to leave the home he shares with her. Her options, in practice, are to manage the situation, to leave and go somewhere else if she has somewhere to go and the resources to get there, or to endure. Ruth knows women in these situations. She is not in one herself, but she is close enough to them to understand what they cost. She brings food when she can. She leaves the door of her apartment open in a way that means she is available if someone needs somewhere to be, without having to say they need somewhere to be. This small, sustained hospitality is one of the things she does that is not on any list and that nobody has asked her to do, and that is absolutely necessary. The question of what poor women did with their leisure time in the 1950s requires some adjustment of the word leisure, because the concept applies in a modified form. What Ruth has that is close to leisure is the radio in the evenings, the library book at night, the Saturday afternoon at the library, and the social hour after church on Sunday, when the congregation gathers in the hall behind the church for coffee and cake, and the kind of community conversation that is both social pleasure and information exchange. She sometimes goes to the movies with Mrs. Kowalski, maybe once every 6 or 8 weeks, when the schedule allows and the budget allows, and there is something playing that both of them want to see. The movies cost 50 cents, which is a significant discretionary expenditure, and they choose carefully. The movies that Ruth and Mrs. Kowalski go to see are the large-screen popular entertainments of the early 1950s. They are not the movies where women like Ruth appear. The movies they watch are full of beautiful women in expensive clothes dealing with glamorous problems in houses that bear no relationship to any home on their street. But they watch them anyway, with a kind of pleasurable suspension of disbelief that is not quite aspiration and not quite irony. It is the entertainment of a world that is not your world, which has its own value that is separate from any identification with the characters. They walk home from the movies talking about it with the particular pleasure of 2 people who have shared an experience and are now processing it together in the October evening air. Past the corner store and the darkened bar and the church with its lit windows, up the stairs to the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Kowalski goes left and Ruth goes right, and each of them goes into an apartment where the children are asleep and the husbands are doing whatever they're doing, and each of them puts the evening away and starts the next day's beginning, which is the same as every day's beginning. This is the engine of it, if you are trying to understand how it worked mechanically. It is not a story with a climax. It is a story with a rhythm. Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday again. The rhythm is a whole story, and within it there are the small variations and small dramas and small pleasures that make a life distinguishable from mere existence. The children grow up. This is the most important thing happening in the household, the most significant process, and it happens slowly enough that you don't see it day to day, and then suddenly you see it all at once. Jimmy is 9 now, and in 4 years he will be 13, and in 9 years he will be 18, and the household will start to change shape around the changing shapes of these 3 children, who are currently using it as their entire world. Ruth is aware of this the way you are aware of the seasons changing, as a background process that is enormous and ordinary simultaneously. She wants for Jimmy what is difficult to articulate, but which she holds very clearly in her mind. She wants for him the ability to choose. She knows that what shapes choices most fundamentally at the level of life she is living is education, and she is attentive to Jimmy's schooling with an attentiveness that she does not have vocabulary for, but that Jimmy's teacher probably notices as the attentiveness of a mother who is paying close attention. She goes to the school meetings. She reads the reports. She asks Jimmy about school every day in a way that is not interrogation, but genuine curiosity and also genuine investment. She knows the names of his teachers. She knows what he finds hard and what comes easily. For Patricia, the wanting is the same but operates in a different landscape, because what a girl can choose in 1953 is already a more bounded set than what a boy can choose, and Ruth knows this too. Patricia is a child of great energy and intelligence and will, and the world she is growing into has specific ideas about what those qualities are for in a woman and what they are permitted to do. Ruth has not entirely decided what she thinks about this. She has lived in it. She has some strong opinions that she holds quietly, in the specific way that working-class women in 1953 hold strong opinions that they know better than to state as general principles in mixed company. She lets Patricia read everything. She encourages Patricia in the things Patricia is good at without qualifying them. She hopes, which is not a policy, but is what you have when policy runs out. Thomas is still largely pre-theoretical. He is too, and his primary concerns are proximity to the people he loves and access to the pot and spoon percussion ensemble. These concerns are being satisfactorily met. The neighborhood itself changes slowly over the course of the decade. By 1955, the first family from a different country has moved in 2 buildings down, a family who came from a country that is still being rebuilt from the war, and they are greeted with a range of reactions on the block that reflects the full spectrum of human response to newness. Curiosity, wariness, warmth, some coldness, and eventually the slow normalizing that happens when people share a block long enough to become simply people on a block. Ruth brings them a pot of soup in the first week. This is what she does with new people. The soup is received with an expression of gratitude that is almost more eloquent than words, which may be partly because words are limited at that particular moment of introduction. By 1957, there is a television in the building. It is in the Martin apartment, and it is a small screen in a large wooden cabinet, and it is a marvel, and Mr. Martin has opinions about who is welcome to watch it and under what circumstances, but somehow the building manages to cluster around on certain evenings for certain programs, and it becomes a community object in a way that nobody exactly planned, but that happens anyway, because television in 1957 has a gravitational quality. Ruth watches it on these evenings with a mix of pleasure and something like recognition. The program's about suburban families with washing machines and 2 cars and husbands who come home in suits are, she finds, interesting and somewhat alien simultaneously. She watches them with the same pleasurable suspension of disbelief she brings to the movies, the enjoyment of a world that is not hers viewed through a small glowing screen in someone else's living room. She does not feel bitter about the gap between that world and hers. She feels something more nuanced, which is a complex response of a person who knows what real life costs and who can appreciate a fantasy without confusing it for an aspiration or taking it as a critique of her own. The day I have been describing, this long, ordinary Tuesday in 1953, is not a crisis day. No one is sick. The heat is working. Earl comes home at a reasonable hour. The money is tight, but not impossible this week. The children are mostly cooperative. In other words, this is a day when things go approximately as well as they can go in Ruth's life, and the catalog of effort it contains is a catalog of a typical day. When things go less well, and they do go less well, the effort increases without the underlying structure changing. A sick child adds a layer. A problem with the landlord adds a layer. A bad week at the factory adds a layer. A tooth that can no longer be managed with aspirin, and finally requires a dentist, and the $12 the dentist will cost add a layer. The layers accumulate over weeks and months and years, and the woman carrying them adjusts her posture accordingly, and mostly she carries them without externally visible strain, which is a form of extraordinary competence that looks, from a distance, like nothing much at all. This is the hidden history of the 1950s, not the crisis history, not the large drama history, but the sustained, daily, physical, financial, social, and emotional labor women who are holding a significant portion of American life together with skill and intelligence and effort that was categorized by their culture as natural and by their economy as valueless and by their families often As simply the way things are, Betty Friedan will call the feminine mystique in 1963, the strange dissatisfaction that the magazines and the advertisements don't acknowledge. But Friedan's subjects are largely the suburban middle-class women who've been sold the most elaborate version of the dream, who have the washing machines and the 2 cars, and are still finding it insufficient. The women we have been with today, Ruth and Luella and Dorothy and Ella, are having a somewhat different experience. They are not suffering from the problem with no name in quite the same way, because the gilded cage was never quite offered to them. They know exactly what their problem is, and it's quite a clear name, which is that they're doing too much work for too little money and too little recognition, and they have too few legal rights and too little access to medical care and too little power over the systems that shape their daily existence. And they are doing it anyway, every single day. This is what I want you to carry with you as this story settles into something quieter. The specific dignity of a woman who gets up at 5:45 and moves through a day that makes enormous demands on her and meets those demands with something that is less like resignation than like a kind of matter-of-fact capability. She knows what she is doing. She is very good at it. She does not require your admiration to do it, but it would be dishonest to watch all this without feeling some. The apartment is quiet now. Thomas is asleep. Jimmy and Patricia are asleep. Earl is asleep. The radiator is doing its little metallic clicking. The refrigerator is humming its small, anxious hum. The street lamp outside is putting its orange light on the alley, and the cat who lives in the alley is sitting on top of the garbage can or has gone somewhere else. Ruth is asleep. She is lying on her side on a mattress with an 11-year-old depression in the springs, the blanket pulled up, her breathing slower and deeper than it is during the day. Her hands are on the pillow near her face, and the Jergens lotion has done some of what it can for the dryness at her knuckles. She is asleep the way people sleep who have used their bodies fully and have more to do in the morning. In 4 hours, give or take, without any alarm clock, she will be awake again. But right now she is asleep, and the apartment is still. And the city outside is doing what the city does at night. It's quieter noises, it's sleeping noises, the traffic that is light now and the train that runs on the tracks 2 miles north, and the distant sounds that cities make when they're not quite resting. The building creaks once, the way old buildings creak when the temperature shifts, a sound like a single syllable of something large and slow. The century is turning in its sleep too. 1953. 1954 is coming. The decade is in the middle of itself, poised between what came before and what is coming, and the people living in it. The women getting up at 5:45 and the women carrying water from wells, and the women running looms in the noise. They are in the middle of all of it, in the middle of America, in the middle of the century, in the middle of their own ordinary, extraordinary lives. History tends to look at a decade and find its broad movements. The suburbanization, the baby boom, the Cold War, the beginning of television, the rise of consumer culture. These are real. They are happening. But beneath them, sustaining them in ways that the broad movements cannot see from their altitude, is the daily specific labor of women who are not in the advertisements and not in the history books and not in the narrative of progress, but who are, in the most literal and fundamental sense, making it possible for all those things to happen by making it possible for everyone around them to have a life. The house that gets cleaned does not advertise itself. The meal that gets made does not leave a record. The child that gets raised does not, at the moment of being raised, understand what is being given. The budget that gets balanced on nothing writes no receipts. The sick neighbor who gets soup writes no review. The letter to the sister gets read and then put in a drawer. The sock that gets darned gets worn. The coat that gets mended keeps someone warm. The bolt that gets fixed keeps the door closed. None of it is large. All of it is necessary. All of it matters. And now the story settles, as all stories eventually do, into particular quiet of its ending. The neighborhood breathes. The city breathes. Ruth breathes. The kitchen is clean and the dishes are dry and tomorrow's breakfast is thought out and the stamp is by the door. If you have been with us for this whole journey, all the way from the cold kitchen at 5:45 to the still apartment at 10:15, thank you for spending this time in this particular part of history with us. Thank you for lying there and listening and letting these lives come to the dark to you. These women deserve to be seen and heard and known, and if we have done even a little of that tonight, then we have done something worth doing. The light is low. The night is old. The history is settling into something that feels, finally, like rest. Close your eyes if you haven't already. The building is still. The radiator has stopped clicking. Even the refrigerator seems to have made peace with itself for tonight. Tomorrow the sun will come up. The coffee will go on. The children will need their lunches packed. The laundry will still be there. The floor will need sweeping. But that is tomorrow. Right now there's only this. The quiet room. The slow breath. The city at rest. The century finding its pause. Sleep well, and thank you for being here.